Well, for me, transpersonal really is more interested in the kind of upper half of human functioning. It's as if you have a normal curve of height or weight or anything, and that most psychology starts at normal and goes down into neurosis and psychopathology and high disturbance. And transpersonal includes that, but also includes the upper half of the curve, which is genius and compassion and creativity, kind of saints and geniuses and artists. And I think we learn much more from the best that human beings can be and have been throughout history than from the defects. And so for me, that's where transpersonal is much more with an emphasis on the top half of that curve. The field of transpersonal psychology, and it's wonderful that it is now a field rather than just a field of dreams, is to allow people to use the skills that psychology is interested in, which is really the study of how does consciousness function, what is the soul, what's the interaction between spirit and matter, and to make full use of what I call the last 5,000 years of good research. Conventional psychology, whatever its wonderfulness, is maybe 200 years old. And so that what happened with transpersonal is the field was already well developed before we ever entered it. And the discoveries that we were allowed to share were very old, very sophisticated, often very intricate. What's often called the great religious traditions or the spiritual systems, but if we put in shamanism and take another 40,000 years back, or look at ancient Egypt, 4,000 or 5,000 years back, what we have is thousands of years of people saying, what is the best that human beings can be, and how can that be supported or accelerated or discovered or uncovered? And out of that has come the technologies that all the spiritual systems have. The theology of all the spiritual systems is, to me, somewhat random and not truly very consequential in the long run when you're interested in personal development. Well, when you are a transpersonal psychologist, what does that really mean? What are you doing? And usually what you're doing is you're incorporating some of this 5,000 years of work and reformatting it, redesigning it, reestablishing it in a contemporary form. So that just as the Dalai Lama said once, that one advantage of being thrown out of Tibet is he got to travel around the world and meet a lot of more interesting people. We in the transpersonal get to ride on the shoulders of thousands of years of saints and get to see whether that is useful for people who have what they would call a non-spiritual life. How does it apply to education, to child rearing, to family? I've done a lot of business consulting, and it's wonderful to be able to come into a business understanding that everyone in the business is innately divine and innately spiritually available. And whether they ever acknowledge it or not is unimportant. And so it's a different perspective, not more than that, but that different perspective makes all the difference. The word transpersonal, remember, has another meaning, which is through or beyond the personality. And when everyone is working in a spiritual system of any sophistication, one quickly learns that one's personality is not the largest box that you come in. And therefore, when one is, and let's use the phrase, working on oneself, that isn't to necessarily work on one's personality. And that when you meet spiritual teachers and you come away and you say, how could this divinely realized being be so neurotic in so many areas? And the answer is that they still have a body, they still have a neurosis, they still have a personality, but it doesn't dominate them. That isn't what they operate from, any more than I operate from indigestion. Roger Walsh said once that the problems of the world are transpersonal problems. The problems of war, the problems of pollution, the problems of overpopulation, all the traditional litany that we all talk about, can be looked at as defects in spiritual awareness. That, as in war, you do not kill people if you begin to realize that we all are, that we're all unified in some deep, profound way. It just doesn't make sense any more than you would kill one of your fingers if it's, if it's in the peanut butter. That the ecological crisis begins to go away when you realize that you're part of all these species, and that again, you're only harming your own deep self. So that there is a way of being in this world that says that the transpersonal is, in a very odd way, the center of the problem and the central place from which solutions come. Well, there are always two histories. There's the history that in 500 years will become what's called hagiography, which is making people into saints, kind of making plaster casts of people. And then there's the kind of gossipy history of all of the human foibles. So that, for instance, it's wonderful that transpersonal psychology was truly started and founded by Tony Sudich, a man who never appeared much in public because he was totally paralyzed with arthritis and lived in a slant bed and could only move one arm and part of his facial muscles. But he, in lying around and to keep his life full and rich and interesting, not for income because he made his living as a psychotherapist, he's founded humanistic psychology. And then because humanistic psychology in a sense topped out, that it turned out we just needed to know something about the spiritual dimensions in order to understand ourselves, that he then founded Transpersonal. And originally it was going to be called meta-humanistic, which is really a son of humanistic psychology or humanistic psychology 2 kind of notion. So that we formed out of one person's mind, which is truly remarkable. And not a person who was in any sense conventional. But this very quiet man living in a suburban tract in Palo Alto founded half of the psychological movements that exist. If we talk about psychoanalytic, behaviorist, humanistic, and transpersonal as the 4 major themes. So the history from that point on is discovering that what Tony had created actually already existed. And that then, when I talk about we then throw in the 5,000 years, that's where that comes from. Is as we began to create this field to kind of break out of the ceiling of humanistic, break through that glass ceiling, and discovered that, whoa, everyone was here before us. And not only that, but everyone was beginning to translate their most sacred scriptures and findings and techniques and procedures and possibilities into English. What a gift it was. So the first few years were, in a sense, riding high off of the joys of discovering that we were not only not alone, but we were with the best company one could find. Another piece of history, early on, Ram Dass, who was then known as Richard Alpert, gave some lectures to groups like the Menninger Clinic. And we got hold of the lectures and edited them for to turn them from speech to prose, basically, published them in our little journal. And then I ran into an editor in New York and got him interested, and we sold those 2 speeches as a book called The Only Dance There Is. And the book did very well, and we said to Ram Dass, what do you want done with your royalties? And he said at that point in his life, I didn't create this material. A lot of it comes from my own study of other people. You've done all the work. Why don't you keep the royalties? And those royalties supported the journal, supported the association, made the difference between the little bit we were charging and the little bit more that we needed to exist on for probably 5-6 years. So that here are people not necessarily associated, quote, with the founding, Anthony Sudich, because people didn't know him and he wasn't visible, and Dick Alpert as Ram Dass, in a transition between the Richard Alpert and the Ram Dass-ness. And the gift generously given, but also correct, is he didn't have anything to do with it beyond giving the speeches. So that's some pieces of the history that are charming and add a kind of a very human flavor. Because some years later he wrote us and said, could he have some of the royalties back? Because it turned out there were other projects he now wanted to support, and of course we said, of course. So it was a kindness. And there was a lot of giving. There was very little wanting and very little taking in as we began to develop this. And I think it shows in how it has continued to spread throughout the world. Maslow is kind of the philosopher grandfather. That Tony Sudich was a great fan of Maslow's, and Maslow was a great fan of Tony Sudich's. And so Tony took a lot of what Maslow was writing as the most famous humanistic psychologist of his day and turned that into kind of some of the foundation, which is, oh, we're really kind of respectable because we are using the works of Abe Maslow as the kind of philosopher psychologist and the works of Carl Rogers as the kind of clinical psychologist. And that was the humanistic core. And then when it went on to transpersonal, Rogers at that point hadn't made the transition. He did near the end of his life, became very transpersonal, but not then at all. He stayed behind, in a sense, with the humanists, in the humanistic people. And then Maslow's work was moving in a transpersonal direction. Maslow was never too comfortable with the transpersonal. It was edgy stuff for him. Spiritual growth, yes. Spiritual systems, particularly Eastern religions, very, very at the edge of his training, and he was just becoming aware of it at his death. So I'd say Maslow is like a foundation stone for this structure, but as we got into it, there were really other builders. The precursor of the Transpersonal Institute was an institute that we sponsored, maybe through Esalen, maybe without it, but it was a summer school at Stanford that had classes from Robert Ornstein and Claudio Naranjo and Charlie Tart and all the wonderful people we knew. And most of the faculty sat in on most of the classes, and the students were driven to a level of frenzy, of excess of good material, because no one had ever had any of these things in classes. We had two Jungian professors from Rome who just could hardly stand it. They were so excited. We had a wonderful person who began to see his teachers hiding in the bushes, teaching him. And we made him take a break for a week or two and made him do lots of running. And then he said, but people would run with him. So he just couldn't stop being taught by high beings. And the graduation photograph is everyone nude in front of a swimming pool. And I recall vividly the Italians who were afraid not to be part of it because the group pressure was quite strong and very New Age California hip. But they very carefully positioned themselves so you could only see their heads and shoulders. So that was the precursor of the educational institution that later became a fully accredited graduate school in California. The part of transpersonal education or transpersonal training, or really the transpersonal graduate programs, and there are a number of them now around the world, that most excites me is that we are able to have a student body that is from all over the planet. And that in a wonderful sense, the internet has come along to make physically manifest the notion that we're all one in a way that's never been possible before. And I really see learning communities, initially in English language, but within a few years, hopefully breaking free of that, that truly communicate with each other and support each other in using what I would call the technology of the sacred, which is both spiritual practices and the way one can use the internet to form a link that's never been possible. So that very esoteric systems, things that are of interest to 8 or 10 people, you can bring those 8 or 10 people together and they don't have to move, and they can work in depth. And what I'm seeing in the global program at ITP is the first seeds of this, and I think it's really the most exciting breakthrough that absolutely uses the 5,000 years of prior work and absolutely uses the rush of technology to make communication and intimate communication easier and better. There's a Sufi saying, or a hadith actually, I think attributed to Muhammad, that says, if you take one step towards him, he comes running towards you.